Hey guys, Bartel's Bookshelf here, and it's the day before Halloween! Yay! We're almost here! It's editing Jesse here to say that it's actually Halloween, yay! But I filmed this yesterday and haven't gotten it uploaded till today, so woo, spooky! So I figured I would finally make another reading wrap-up video, just sort of talking about sort of end of Halloween reads. I've actually read quite a bit in the last 2.5 weeks since I made my last video. I've read 6 books, so I've been doing really well this month with the reading. I'm really happy about that. Not everything has been great, unfortunately, which we'll get to here in a second. But recently, I did actually have another 5-star read, so I was really happy about that. But let's get into it. As always, I apologize if I'm rambling and unfocused. If I need to fill in any gaps, I'll put text up or whatever. But first here we have Halloweenland by Sarrantonio. This is actually the 3rd book in the author's Orangefield series, which is about a town where like spooky shit happens every Halloween. I actually read the first book, which I believe was called Horrorween. I read that about 10 years ago, and honestly I don't remember a whole lot about it. But when I was digging through my boxes of books, just trying to look for things to read for spooky season and stuff, I found this and I was like, why not? 'Tis the season. Frankly, this was disappointing. I figured there was a reason that I didn't remember much of the first book, and this proves it. Basically, this follows a detective named Bill Grant. He was in the previous 2 books. I haven't read the second one, but I sort of remember the first one because this fills you in a little bit. And he keeps having encounters with this Lord of the Dead, this creature named Samhain, or Sam for short, who is kind of the Lord of the Dead, the spirit of Halloween, etc. And he's trying to wreak havoc. This one deals with Samhain attempting to bring about the birth of this sort of antichrist figure who comes in the form of this little girl who can kill people with her touch and stuff like that. And along the way to try and defeat Samhain, he kind of goes to Ireland, explores sort of the history of it and stuff like that. All good stuff, right? In fact, the main thing that intrigued me about this that's mentioned on the back is a carnival which is the titular Halloweenland, which is being run by this mysterious guy named Mr. Dickens. And that was the main reason I wanted to pick this up. But the carnival doesn't even feature in the book until like the last 20 or 30 pages or so, and we don't get a whole lot of it before we're moving into the actual climax of the book, which was really disappointing. And as I say, the overall book was disappointing too. From what I remembered about the first book, and I actually went back and I read my old Goodreads review to kind of refresh my memory a little bit. It's okay. It's not bad, but it's very sort of generic and kind of doesn't really do anything surprising or go anywhere sort of unusual or interesting. And again, that pans out with this book. There's a lot of interesting ideas. The idea of the Halloween carnival is really cool. There's some decent sequences there. There's a scene where he goes to... There's an extended section of the book where he goes to Ireland and explores a little bit of like the history of Halloween, which is kind of interesting but feels a little bit pointless. And I just didn't find that a lot of the plot lines sort of resolved themselves in an interesting way. In fact, I'm already trying to think of like stuff to say about it, even though it's only been about 2 weeks since I read it. So, this unfortunately was really disappointing, and I feel bad because Sarrantonio was a very popular editor, and I've read a few of the collections and anthologies and stuff that he edited, and I really liked them, including Stories, which is edited by him and Neil Gaiman. He actually passed recently, which is very sad. But I just think he might have been a better editor than he was a writer. Like I say, this wasn't terrible, but it was very generic, middle of the road, 2.5 stars type thing. It tries to sort of delve into the history of Halloween and tries to sort of say something meaningful about Halloween and everything, but I just don't feel like it really captured it. And aside from a few sort of mentions of like decorations and obviously the carnival and things like that, it doesn't feel very Halloween-y to me, you know? It's mostly just an investigation story with this detective trying to track down who the girl is and what Samhain wants with her, which, as we can assume that has something to do with destroying the world, the things that he finds out aren't particularly revelatory or interesting. In fact, I guess this is kind of a spoiler, but since it mentions it on the back, there's this whole thing where he's trying to find out, more about this, and of course it ends up leading back to the carnival, which we knew because we read the back of the book, and we know that it involves a Halloween carnival, and it also mentions the carnival in the very beginning of the book as they're setting up, too. So obviously we know the third act of this book is going to take place at this carnival, but we're supposed to act like this major revelatory, crazy twist when we find out that, this character is connected to this carnival and stuff like that. I just thought it was really lame. And there were a few attempts at humor that just didn't really land. There was a lot about it that was just very disappointing, unfortunately. I don't remember if I have the second book, Hallows' Eve. In fact, part of the reason I jumped into this was because I felt fairly certain I wouldn't need to know anything about what happened in the second book. But then, of course, during the final climax of the book, they actually reference things and characters that happened in the second book that I totally missed out on. If I have the book, I might read it for another Halloween, we'll see, but I'm really just not impressed based on both of these books now, which is really sad to me, because how do you fuck up a Halloween book about a Halloween carnival, But that's life, It's a gamble every time. Next, I read this big boy, Paperbacks from Hell, by Grady Hendrix. I've had this book for ages, since it came out, really, in 2017. And obviously, I was kind of there for the whole Paperbacks from Hell boom. I have about half of the reprints that Valancourt put out. I actually was there from the very beginning, reading not only the original Paperbacks from Hell articles that Grady Hendrix wrote for Tor, now Reactor, but I was there pretty early on with Will Erickson's blog, Too Much Horror Fiction, which he assisted with writing this as well. This was kind of the culmination of all of that sort of paperback horror resurgence. But I'd never read the actual book. I bought it, and it's obviously the type of thing that's right up my alley, but for some reason I just never read it until now. And then I found this other booktuber, Liminal Spaces, who I really, really like. He's just got a great energy, he's super chill, he loves sort of vintage horror, and has a lot of interesting things to say about it. And he talked about finding a lot of good reads from this book, and just sort of about how it inspired him to go and seek out some of these things and stuff like that, and how it really sort of reignited a lot of his sort of love for horror, and made him want to get back into that stuff. And so I was like, hell, it's Halloween, why not? Let's do it. So I read it, and it was great. It's a very quick read because, it's meant more as sort of an overview of the whole 70s, 80s paperback horror boom. Without the index and everything, it's only about 220 pages. And it's very visual. There's text, obviously, but it's more about sort of the overall vibe and the pictures and everything, and just kind of soaking in that atmosphere. And on that level, it's pretty good. I do think it's a little bit slight, and a lot of the stuff in here is actually revised stuff from his earlier Paperbacks from Hell articles. So if you're looking for kind of more insight onto the paperback horror boom and sort of a more detailed history of it, you're not going to find it here, unfortunately. But I don't think that's really the aim of the book. It's more just meant to be an overview and to kind of present you with all of this, lurid imagery, all of these like crazy book covers and stuff. And in that respect, it's a big success. It's great to just flip through here and take in all of this amazing cover art and just to sort of soak in, the vibes, the spooky vibes. I really miss the days when, people marketed horror books like this. One of the things that the book talks about a lot is sort of just the sheer audacity of it, of how, a lot of writers just went out of their way to be as over the top and taboo breaking and just insane as possible. And if you're into that kind of stuff and you read this book and you don't come away with a huge list of like future reads, we're just not on the same level, unfortunately, as much as I adore this whole Paperbacks from Hell boom, and I'm so glad it's receiving so much prominence and people are talking about it and there's been reprints and stuff, it's made collecting this stuff basically impossible unless you're made of money. While I was reading the book, I kept Googling various titles that sounded interesting, and yeah, it was very difficult to find anything that was under $25, although I did buy a couple things just because I couldn't resist. They sounded crazy, and they were affordable. So, yeah, it really does just... It's a great overview. It really makes me want to get back into this stuff, but getting back into this stuff is hard now that there's been this huge resurgence, but that's not the book's fault. This is a great introduction to this whole era, I think. It breaks everything up into loose categories. So, you know, for example, yeah, like Hail Satan, Creepy Kids, When Animals Attack, Real Estate Nightmares, Weird Science, etc. And one of the interesting things that I liked about the structure of the book was that the beginning of each category is prefaced. So, for example, the first chapter is Hail Satan, and the beginning of each chapter is prefaced by the books that influenced that era or that type of horror fiction. So in this case, what led to that whole resurgence of, you know, satanic literature: Rosemary's Baby, Thomas Tryon's The Other, William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, you know, and it talks a little bit briefly about the history of that. As I say, it's not really meant to be a sort of detailed history book. It's more of an overview, opening the door for you to walk through if you wish to. And it even goes into a little bit of and it talks about the Satanic Panic and stuff like that, and the Omen and everything. And it's just amazing some of the crazy things that these people wrote about, and some of the cover art that was made to go along with it. Like this very famous one for Shaun Hutson's Spawn, which was does it say who painted it? It was someone famous. It was a famous horror author. I'll look it up. And that's actually another thing that I really liked about this as well, is that there's little sort of little vignettes throughout where they talk about various paperback horror authors, like in this case Jill Bauman, and they go into sort of a little bit of the history of the artist and some of the things they drew, and it's all just really interesting. If you have like an affinity for this kind of stuff, I think this is just a really good, cozy, read, and I really enjoyed it. I do wish it was a little bit more in-depth. I do wish he actually kind of dug for some deeper insights rather than just kind of revising a lot of the articles that he wrote. But, I mean, just as just a complete package, I mean, like, how could you not love this, I mean, it's just so much fun to flip through. And I think, I probably will, over the years... Zebra and all their skeletons. I probably will be flipping through this over the years just to kind of remind myself of books that sound interesting, or just to enjoy the cover, the cover art. I mean, it's just beautiful. So, yeah, it's very interesting. I don't necessarily know if it's worth a buy unless you're like really, really into this stuff. But yeah, it's well produced. It's a thick book. It's an entertaining read. It was good for spooky season. I'm glad I read it. And it got me to look up some things that I didn't know about previously and hopefully discover some new reads, and that's what's important, right? The Paperbacks from Hell was kind of just an impromptu read, but this was one that I had set aside specifically for spooky season because it's another one that's been sitting on my shelves for a few years, and it's by an author that I really, really enjoyed previously, and that is Howl by Shaun David Hutchinson. Shaun David Hutchinson, or SDH as I call him. Previously, he wrote We Are the Ants and At the Edge of the Universe, both of which I've reviewed on my channel, and I really, really enjoyed. So much so that basically when I found out about this, I went out and bought it immediately because this is about a teenage werewolf, a gay teenage werewolf. And I'm sorry to say, this was disappointing too. That was really hard for me to take because, as I say, I've really enjoyed this author before, but anyway, I'll get into it. This is about a young teen named Virgil Knox, and he and his dad have moved back to his dad's hometown, which is in this kind of small southern area, as his dad's trying to kind of get back on his feet and stuff. And Virgil's kind of struggling with, moving to a small town where, his gayness is a little bit more sort of questionable, and it's a little bit more conservative and more sort of closed off. And he ends up going to a party one night where he blacks out. He doesn't remember what happened. Out, sort of in the swamp. I don't remember. It's not swamps exactly. They have a name for it, but I can't remember what it is at the moment. But he's attacked out there by a creature, a mysterious creature, and while people don't necessarily disbelieve him, they don't necessarily believe that it was a monster, like he insists, and they kind of are victim blaming him for it, saying like, well, what were you doing out there? You shouldn't have been drinking. You shouldn't have been hanging out with the wrong people, And so he's sort of driven further into himself while these strange changes start taking over his body. That's all well and good, right? Like classic werewolf premise. I'm here for that. But this one just didn't work for me. I don't know if it's because I'm so critical of werewolf stories that I kind of like look at them more harshly than I would, other types of things, but none of this really cohered for me. There's this conflict that develops between him and this guy who's like sort of manipulating him, who's like kind of sort of you're not really sure where you stand with him, and he's kind of like being very flirtatious, but also kind of very cruel at the same time, and you're not really sure where to get a beat on him, And there's this whole thing about, there's this theme that develops throughout the book where, if he's turning into a monster, he's only a monster if he decides to be one. And this character that he's sort of interacting with kind of represents that side of him, of going down this monstrous side. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that it could say about sort of like toxic friendships and being, and being manipulated by, conniving people, amidst your own kind of loneliness and isolation. Growing up in a small town, trying to fit in, fitting in with the wrong people. But I just never felt like the character just kind of remains a cipher throughout the book, and you never really like get to know him in the way that you get to know a lot of other characters in SDH's other books, because the thing about the previous books I've read is that they usually involve some type of conflict like that, a depressed gay teen, struggling, alone, isolated, dealing with his feelings toward, maybe a bully that he has, or, this guy that he likes, maybe both. And the thing about it was that there was always a lot going on in his books, but the main cast was so well-defined and well-focused on that you felt like you believed them and you were with them no matter where kind of the rest of the story went. But to me, it just kind of like, it never cohered. I never really bought Virgil as a character because he kind of just seems to change arbitrarily depending on the needs of the plot, which I get, it ties into, being a werewolf and having all these new feelings. That's a kind of a classic werewolf theme, but there's no kind of like through line through any of it. There's no sense of like movement or pace. You know what I mean? The pacing is weird. It's kind of jagged and like he's kind of presented as this very shy character, but then he also like loves acting and he gets into acting class. And again, I could sort of understand that if they tied it more heavily into kind of the changes taking place with him and how it felt and what he was going through, and there's a bit of that, but it feels very glossed over and just very surface level. It doesn't really dive in the way that his previous books did. And a similar thing is that there's just way too much stuff going on in this book, which is weird because it's not a complicated plot, but he's kind of trying to, and it's a criticism I've had of his previous books, even the ones that I really enjoyed, where he tends to have a lot of ideas and a lot of characters and a lot of sort of themes that he wants to touch on in the same book, which oftentimes is to his detriment. But as I say, even if the other themes and the sort of ancillary themes in his other books weren't as well developed, he always had a focus on the main characters and who they were and what they were going through, and that was all really well done before. But in this, it just felt kind of messy and rushed, and I don't know what happened. I don't know why this just didn't land for me, but it just didn't have that spark, which was really, really upsetting because I loved this author's previous books. I gave At the Edge of the Universe 5 stars, I said he's like kind of one of my new favorites, so that was really disappointing. And as for like the werewolf stuff, it's okay. There's this whole thing where it's doing that kind of classic thing where it's using werewolfism as a metaphor for, sort of, not just sort of being a teenager and the changes that you go through then, but sort of changing into the changes that a teenager makes, just in terms of personality, of like who they're going to be, becoming someone new when you go to a new place, deciding who you're going to change into, and there's also this sort of undercurrent of sort of a sexual assault to it, where the attack happens to him, but it's sort of presented in the language of a sexual assault, where he's sort of like remembering things and kind of not eating and having like panic attacks and stuff. It's all very metaphorical, and that's all really interesting. And there's some body horror stuff where he gets these like hard like lesions on his body with like hair growing out them, and he peels them off, and it's like really painful and gross. And there's actually some really good stuff with that. There's a really great scene where he pulls out one of them and this big hair comes out, and it's like this big thick gushy thing like dripping with kind of sputum, and blood and stuff, and it pulsates like an organ, and he kind of feels it, and that was really, really well done. But it seems like it's kind of going for this thing where you're not sure if it's in his head or if it's actually happening to him. And while I enjoy that kind of obfuscation sometimes, in this, it just felt kind of like wishy-washy and kind of fence-sitting, like he didn't want to commit to either direction, where, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be a monster story or just sort of a teen angst story couched in these monstrous metaphors. And I get it, it's a potent metaphor. That's why I love werewolves so much, I love them, but I just felt like all of it, like the kernels of something were there, but it didn't come together into a coherent mass, if that makes sense, So yeah, generally it was just very disappointing, and I was really sad about that, because I've had this book on my shelf for a couple years now, and I've always been looking at it and thinking about it and wanting to read it. Excuse me, and wanting to read it. And that cover is so good. It's so, like, sort of pop arty and has a little bit of that sort of paperback horror feeling to it. But none of that really pans out in the book, and I was really, really sad about that. I do want to read SDH's other books. I have When We Disappear, I believe, somewhere on my shelf. So I do still really like him. And there was stuff that I liked in this book. Like I said, there were individual elements that worked, but it just didn't come together. So yeah, I'm sorry to say that was really disappointing. I mean, maybe just like I say, maybe I'm just being overly critical because it's a werewolf book. I looked up a few other sort of professional reviews, Publishers Weekly, that kind of thing, and they seem to like it, and it's got a pretty good score on Goodreads and stuff. So maybe I'm just wrong, but yeah, this was the first disappointment from Shaun David Hutchinson, sadly. But you can't win them all, right? And then next, I finished this book. This is the second Fontana book of great ghost stories, edited by Robert Aickman. I started this, I think, at the beginning of September, like mid-September, somewhere around there. And I've been kind of poking through it as I was, going through spooky season. And then, it was getting kind of towards mid-October, third week of October, and I was like, man, I really got to finish this because I was really enjoying it, but, it's all very old-fashioned ghost stories. And yeah, I finally sat down and I finished it, and I really, really liked it. I've heard a lot about these sort of various horror anthologies, British horror anthologies, that were kind of everywhere in, 60s, 70s, 80s. I don't know why, that just kind of seemed to be sort of the thing with a lot of British horror readers and stuff. The short stories were everywhere. In fact, Rhys Shearsmith and Steve Pemberton, the creators of Inside Number 9, which is a great British anthology show, very dark comedy, very, horror elements if you get a chance to watch. Highly recommend. They talked about a lot of those anthologies being inspirations for them. And of course, you had like the Amicus anthology films in the 70s, 60s and 70s and stuff that, provided further influence. So basically British horror is very much about sort of the ghost story and the anthology and stuff. And it's something I've always been fascinated by. And I bought a bunch of these in the UK when I visited last Christmas. So I figured I might as well read one for spooky season. And I'm glad I did because I really liked it. These all, as I say, are very old-fashioned. This was published originally in 1966, I believe. Yeah, 1966. This version is from 1973. I prefer these later editions because they have this incredible cover art. I mean, look at that. Isn't that amazing? And they're all like this. They all have cover art like that, which is so cool. But yeah, they're all... it was published in the 60s, but it's all mostly old-fashioned stories. I think there's maybe two or three, maybe four stories that come from like the 20th century. Most of these are from the mid to late 1800s, which was kind of, early, going into like the early 1900s, which is sort of the classic ghost story form. So these are all very, very representative of that. It was one of those things where I went into it thinking it might be a little creaky and boring. And as always with someone who's not used to reading older, like very old literature a lot, there is kind of like a little, you have to adjust a little bit, but once I was in, I was in. And while I thought a lot of these were just going to kind of be generic ghost stories, a lot of them were actually had really interesting little twists to them. There's a few ones that I was familiar with, like The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar by Edgar Allan Poe. But there were a few that I'd read for the first time, like Man Size in Marble by Edith Nesbit, which I wanted to read because it was last year it was turned into a ghost story for Christmas. I really, really liked that story about, sort of a statue coming to life, But my favorite one in this was the third story, which is also, I believe, the longest story in the collection. That is How Love Came to Professor Gilday by Robert Hutchins. That's this novella about this sort of cranky, sort of misanthropic man who's a sort of intellectual, he's a professor, and he's invented all of these things that have provided great usefulness to humanity, but he has this very misanthropic view of them where he basically completely rejects any kind of, like, emotional or romantic connection with anybody or anything, he doesn't believe in sentimentality or anything like that, and he befriends, ironically, this priest who basically has the opposite viewpoint of him. He believes all creatures are beautiful and man cannot live without beauty and friendship and all that stuff. They end up becoming sort of unlikely friends, and they end up getting really sort of close to each other. And Professor Gilday shares something very strange that's been happening to him recently, where he has this strange encounter with this creature that seems to be laying out on a bench across from him. But when he goes to see it, it's gone. But it's almost as if the creature has followed him back into his house. And rather than a typical sort of malevolent haunting, a ghost that just wants to scare you and injure you, it almost seems enraptured with him. So it's a very, very interesting depiction of a very different type of ghost, rather than the oppressiveness of a haunting of malevolence. It's the oppressiveness of sort of obsessive love towards somebody who doesn't want it, who profoundly rejects it, and through that is forced to sort of confront his own feelings on the matter. And I thought it was incredibly well done. I'd never heard of Robert Hutchins before. I don't think he wrote very much, but I found that story has been anthologized quite a bit. I think also in one of the David Hartwell collections, I believe. I'll have to look that up. But it's heavily, heavily anthologized, and I can see why. Just the way that it explores this sort of the sort of psychological struggles of this professor, and the pain that his friend feels for him, and how he's trying to sort of help him through it, help him to accept love into his heart, essentially. You can kind of read a sort of homoerotic element into it almost, which I thought was interesting, very daring for the time, where it's almost like, is his affection and his love for this new priest friend almost bringing on this haunting in a way to sort of force him to accept what he doesn't want to accept, It was very, very interesting, really, really well done. And then the other one that I wanted to talk about, The Inner Room by Robert Aickman. Robert Aickman always usually put one of his own stories in here. And Robert Aickman is it's not that he's hit or miss for me, I just have to be in the right mood for him. It's very much in that vein of quiet horror where, like, I kind of feel like there's a very fine line between being unsettled and being bored. But this was a really, really good story. It's also fairly long. It's about 30 pages, and it's about this woman who's reminiscing on her memories as a little girl when she bought this strange, mysterious little dollhouse that she couldn't open up, and there were these creepy dolls inside of it, all kind of matted and covered in dust, facing away from her. And with her brother, she kind of studies sort of the architecture of the house and finds out that there's this hidden room inside that they can't seem to get to. And then she has an encounter many, many years later when she gets lost in a forest, and she finds a house that looks just like the one from her childhood. And it's just an incredibly dread-filled, unsettling story. Like a lot of Robert Aickman's stories, there's nothing overtly violent or grotesque in it, but there's just this incredible sense of the uncanny and of just something being wrong that is just when it hits you, you know, and you feel it, and it's really, really arresting and great. I really, really liked that. And the final story was also really good, Afterward by Edith Wharton. I'd heard a lot about Edith Wharton's ghost stories. I actually have a collection of them somewhere. But again, it was great, and it was also fairly long as well. It was about. I noticed that a lot of the stories I enjoyed were the longer ones that really took the time to develop the scenario and kind of the psychology of the characters, and this was no exception. This story is about a woman who moves into a supposedly haunted house with her husband, and she and her friends have sort of a discussion about haunted houses and the nature of ghosts and stuff like that. And her friends kind of tell her, you know, ghosts usually strike when you least expect it. You know, you never know you've seen a ghost until afterward, you know, which is where the title comes from. And she encounters a scenario exactly like that. And again, just the way that the atmosphere is developed, and the way that all these little clues are dropped that then sort of come together to this moment of realization is really, really well done. It's one of those things where we can kind of see where the story is going. We can kind of guess what it all means, but we sort of follow the narrator with mounting horror as she kind of starts to understand alongside us and what that might mean, you know. And it's just very, very bleak and very brutal. Just very psychologically adept. That was something I found very fascinating about a lot of the stories in this book in general, is that even if there were just kind of generic hauntings, the hauntings usually revealed something about the characters, and I thought that was really, really well done, and really made the stories a lot more, just that much more arresting and interesting to read. So I'm definitely looking forward to reading more of these collections at some point in the future. I've got 2 through 5, I believe, as well as a few Pan Book of Horror stories, so yeah, this is great. My only real critique, and the only story that I didn't really enjoy in the collection, was a Lord Dunsany story. Dunsany, I think it's pronounced. Lord Dunsany. Called Our Distant Cousins. And this just wasn't even a ghost story at all. It was like this weird, tall tale about this guy who tells another guy about a time he built a rocket ship and went to Mars. I think it's Mars. It's either Mars or Venus, one of those. And he meets these these kind of weird, sort of subservient humanoid creatures who are being eaten up by bigger aliens, you know, and I don't really see what made that a ghost story, and the way that it was written, it wasn't written like a horror story at all. Like I say, it's more of like a tall tale, shaggy dog kind of thing, where you're sort of laughing at the absurdity of it, so I don't really know what that was about. It wasn't necessarily a bad story. It just sort of reminded me of a lot of one of those kind of generic early science fiction stories in the vein of something like H.G. Wells, where just some character goes to another planet and a bunch of weird shit happens to them and then they go back. I just felt like it wasn't really on the same level as the other stories in the collection and didn't really have the same sort of impact. But other than that, this is a really satisfying, just collection of just good classic ghost stories that I really, really enjoyed. So highly recommend if you can find any of these stories or these collections out there in the wild. And then finally, we have my last read for this Halloween season, and my first and my 5-star read for this session. This is Conjure Wife by Fritz Leiber. You might have seen me reading this on some of my reading sprint streams. This is another one that was actually recommended by Liminal Spaces. He talked about in a recent video about 10 horror books, or I think it was 11 horror books that he read and really enjoyed over his course of like reading for the YouTube channel and stuff. And this was on there, and he had so much praise for it that I remembered I had this old copy, and I pulled it out and I read it, and yeah, this was great. I really liked this. So this is a sort of suburban gothic horror story about this professor named Norman Saylor. He works at this kind of Midwest university named Hempnell, which is sort of your typical sort of incestuous university where it's all full of, gossip and sort of sniping and inter-office conflict, very conservative. And he's kind of a very liberal-leaning professor and talks about a lot of things that sort of get up the ire, that sort of stoke the ire of some of the other women on the faculty, who are married to the faculty staff and stuff. But he's a rationalist. He believes in only what he can see and hear, what he can verify. But he studies, anthropology, so he's kind of he spends a lot of time working with people who have different sort of spiritual, magical beliefs and stuff. So he's aware of all of it. And then he goes to see his wife one day, and he finds her doing witchcraft. She has all these charms and all of these wards and sigils and things and little baggies of graveyard dirt and all kinds of stuff that she's been employing to sort of, as she says, to protect him. And of course he tells her, no, this is ridiculous, you're being delusional, kind of talks her down from her sort of psychosis, and gets her to burn, and destroy all of the charms, all the wards, everything. And then the second he removes the last charm from a locket that she gave him, throws it in the fire, he feels a change that comes over him. And the rest of the book basically follows him as he begins to learn that maybe his wife wasn't so delusional after all, and that there may be magic, witchcraft, all throughout him that's constantly being used to undermine his career and his life and everything. Led by some of these women, these wives of these faculty members, in order to get their own leg up in the world. And this was just a fascinating book. I mean, it's incredibly well written. I don't know a whole lot about Fritz Leiber. I don't know if he spent time as an academic or whatever, but this feels like somebody who's spent a lot of time there. As I say, sort of the echo chambers, the gossip, sort of the petty little peccadillos that everybody sort of needles each other over, the sort of ladder climbing that goes on. But it suffuses all of that with this sense of sort of suburban, as I say, suburban gothic, because from the minute everything starts to go wrong, all of these things that he sort of saw as just normal part of everyday life start to take on this sort of sinister intent, this sort of sinister feeling. And there's a couple of really great scenes of like suspense and just unsettlingness in this, I particularly liked this whole sequence where there's this stone dragon that's near his, that's like right outside the window of his office. And he keeps looking at it throughout the day, and as a few of the days go by. And he could swear that it's moving just a little bit, but it can't be, right? And then that culminates in this bravura scene where he's being attacked by this, assumedly, this stone dragon creature, but we never get a good look at it. It's in the middle of the rain, and there's lightning, and you're not really sure what he's seeing. He's not really sure what he's seeing. And she and his wife ends up sort of saving him at the last minute by tying this this magical charm and then pulling the cords taut, and then the whole thing stops. And it's just I can't explain it in the same way that it comes across in the book, but it's just so tight, so suspenseful, so atmospheric, really, really good. And there's a bunch of stuff like that in this book where it's that sort of idea of kind of the veil being lifted and sort of this slow realization that the supernatural is everywhere and it is not good for you. It is not here with helpful intent, But one of the other things that I found really fascinating about it and that made it a really interesting read was that it's almost kind of it's sort of a proto-feminist work. Obviously, it was published in the 40s. This book edition was published in the 50s. It can be a bit regressive in some of its, sexual politics and stuff. But the sort of realization that that Norman comes to through this experience with his wife Tansy and her practicing witchcraft is just how fragile his life is without her to back him up, to do all of this stuff for him behind his back. And that's kind of a recurring theme throughout the book, where even the witches, the other witches who are evil, who are trying to undermine him and his wife, they're doing all they're doing in the same vein. They're doing all of this behind their husbands' backs, working hard in ways that their husbands will never understand to sort of further their careers, while their husbands are kind of just off dawdling, doing their little academic pursuits and enjoying their lives, and they have no idea how hard the women in their lives are working behind them to keep them going, to support them. And I thought that was really fascinating, a really fascinating stance for a book like this to take from this time period, acknowledging the strength and the power that women have that may not manifest in ways that we traditionally think that they do, and of the secret lives of women and of sort of the unknowable sort of mystery of women, especially that a lot of men have, where it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. I come home and my wife is there to take care of me and I thank her, and then I'm off to do my work and everything, and they have no utter idea of the sacrifices that she might be making to help him, I just thought it was a really fascinating metaphor for that. And ultimately, the sort of arc of the character of Norman throughout the book is kind of learning to acknowledge what his wife has done for him, and not only to acknowledge what his wife has done for him, but to be there for her just as much as she is for him. It's a profoundly feminist and very open-minded and very sort of liberal take on male and female politics, gender roles and stuff for this time period. So yeah, this was a great book. I've read a bit of Fritz Leiber before. I've read some Fafford and the Grey Mouser and some of his short stories, but so far this is my favorite. I loved this. It was creepy and atmospheric, and it had a lot of really fascinating things to say. I have a few other of his books, especially his horror books, that I really want to get to. I think I have a copy of Our Lady of Darkness, which sounds like kind of a similar vibe to this, so I really need to track that down and read it. Yeah, thank you, Liminal Spaces, for getting me to finally pull this off my shelf and read it, because this was great. I loved this. Definitely one of my favorite reads of spooky season, I think. So, yeah, highly, highly recommended. And it was also made into a movie, a couple movies, one in the 40s called Weird Woman, I believe, and one called Burn Witch Burn, which had a screenplay by Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, which I really, really need to watch, so I'm going to check that out at some point. So yeah, just a great slice of sort of suburban gothic. Highly, highly recommended. And those were the rest of my reads for the Halloween season. As always, I'm a little sad that it's ending. It's nice to feel sort of seen and understood for 1 month out of the year, but, as I often say, a real spooky bitch is spooky all year round. So one thing that I sort of reflected on as I've been, re-engaging with a lot of horror literature for spooky season and stuff is just how much I missed it, how much I love it. When I first got back into reading from like 2014 to like 2017, like a good like 50, 60, 70% even of my reads were horror books. I was following along with Grady Hendrix and Will Erickson and all those people, and re-engaging with all of this stuff that I'd kind of left by the wayside, and I loved it. I loved discovering all these new reads, and kind of exploring the darkness and embracing it in a way that I don't do as often as I used to anymore. So I've got my little pile here still of spooky reads that I had kind of set aside for September and October, but I want to keep working through them because I don't know. I love horror, man. I love the darkness. I love, the fear, the terror, the imagination. It just really kind of reignited that desire for me. So I'm glad that happened, and I'm glad that I ended this spooky season on a very happy note. So, as much as I'm sad that it's over, at least I can still ride the wave, But until then, I'll see you guys next time, and I hope you all have a great, wonderful Halloween. Samhain, when the veil of the spirit world lifts just a little bit, and you feel the chill in the air, enjoy it, man. Enjoy that. Enjoy cutting loose. Enjoy the darkness, All right, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.